Hello and welcome to the SewFiStore YouTube channel for this medium box bag. You can purchase the kit to make this bag on my Etsy store, which will be linked below. And when finished, this bag will measure 5 inches in height and roughly 6 inches in width. Let's get started. In your kit you will have received 2 pieces of your outer fabric, 2 pieces of fusible fleece and 2 pieces of the navy lining for the polycotton. You will also have received a piece of fabric which measures about 6 inches by 2.5 inches, a zip which is slightly longer than your outer fabric, and your zipper pull. So the first thing we need to do is attach our fusible fleece to our outer fabric. So the fleece has 2 sides. You have this kind of softer side and the other side has these bumpy white dots on them, and this is your glue. So what we need to do, on the wrong side of your fabric, so the side without the pattern, we are going to line up the dots, the dotty side, and get that positioned in place. That. Turn it over so we can see the right side, so the side with the pattern. And then this is where you need your tea towel. So you need to get your tea towel a little bit damp. So just run it under the cold tap and lie it on top like so. Now with this, we're not going to do a sweeping iron motion like you do when you're ironing your clothes. You're just going to gently place the iron on top, so holding much of the weight of the iron yourself. Go over this about 15 seconds, 10-15 seconds. You happy with that? Let's just turn it over, have a quick check to see that it's stuck. Okay, that is ready to go. And next, what I am going to do on all pieces, so both lining pieces, I'm going to fold it in half along the long edge, the 11 inch edge, and put a very small snip, just small. Like so. And that's marking the center for me, so I'm going to do that on both my linings and on my zip. So now we're moving on to attaching the zip. So with the right side of your outer fabric facing up, get your zip with the teeth side up and lay it flat, and match your center of your zip to your center of your outer fabric. And I'm just going to put a couple of clips, and I'm lining up the edge of the zip to the edge of the outer fabric. And now I'm going to get one of my lining pieces. Now you'll notice that this lining fabric, both sides look exactly the same. So I'm not concerned about right side, wrong side, what side looks nicer. I think they both look pretty much the same. If you're using a different lining piece and you do have a right side and a wrong side, at this point you would need to have the right side of the lining fabric down, so we have right sides facing together. Okay. So I'm once again lining up the center, lining up my edges so that I've got my lining edge, my zip edge and my outer fabric edge all lining up. Okay, to the sewing machine. And we're going to stitch across our raw edge here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just line the edge up with your 1/4 inch. Put down, needle down, and we're going to do a back stitch to start. Just make sure that all your edges are lined up nice and neat, and that you're keeping in line with your 1/4 inch mark. Right, now that's all stitched up, unfold them so the zip's in the middle, and just check that it's even all the way down, and then fold those two sides together to the wrong side, exposing the other side of your zip. And then we're going to do exactly the same as what we did first. Got the right side of our outer fabric, and we're going to line up the teeth side of the zip, marking the centers. And once again, we're going to line the right side. This would be the right side, and I'm going to get my centers marked up again, and get my raw edges, my zip edge and the raw edges of my fabric all lined up and clipped into place. Once you're happy, let's take it back to the sewing machine. Okay, so it's exactly the same as the first time. So your piece of work should now look something like this. You have your two right sides of fabric with your zip teeth in the middle, and you have your two lining pieces. And what we're going to do now is going to give this a press. We want this nice and flat. At this point, just put a couple of clips in just to keep the lining where you want it, because our next step is to top stitch, and we don't want the lining moving about when we do that. Okay, so back to the sewing machine. So now we want to top stitch down the edge of the outer fabric, so just down this side and this side. So if I'm using a standard foot to do this top stitching, what I tend to do, now my sewing machine, I can change the position of the needle, but so a standard foot, you will have this gap where your needle will be sewing. So what I tend to do is line the edge of the main fabric up with this gap. That's my guide. What I'm going to do, I'm going to move my needle 3 millimeters to the right, So I am top stitching 1/2 centimetre, 5mm away from the edge of my fabric. And as I'm sewing along, I'm just gently pulling the fabric away. Top stitching, so I'm now going to do exactly the same on the other side. Now it's time to add the zip. So to add the zip, just going to separate the zip itself just by about an inch, 1.5 inches. Get your zipper pull, and the larger end we're going to slide the zipper teeth in each side. Now this can be a bit fiddly, may take a couple of goes if you like to pop out. Once you've got them slid in, place it back onto your surface, and rather than pulling the pull itself, I'm going to push on the slider part. Okay. Now if you've attached your slider and you've got a bump maybe on one side, and if you have one side shorter than the other, what you can do, because this is an open zip, and zip it all the way to the end, separate this and zip it back, and that will fix any bumps that you have in the zip. Now it's time to attach the two pieces together. So let's fold one side over, and we're going to line up our bottom edge all lined up. Just put a couple of clips in, and we're going to sew along here with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, just this long bottom edge. And we're also going to do the same with our lining. So I'm going to line that up and put a couple of clips in. Now with the lining, we want to leave a gap in our bottom edge, so we can turn our bag through. So I'm just going to put a clip there, so I know that this is going to be my gap. So this is, I know, maybe about 3 inches. Okay, let's go to the sewing machine. So I've already gone ahead and sewn my 1/2 inch seam on my outer fabric, and let's do our lining fabric. Line it up for 1/2 inch. Now I'm going to back stitch again, and go to my next marker, 1/2 inch, and back stitch. I definitely want to back stitch at the beginning and end of these openings, because we're going to be turning through the bag, which is going to put a lot of force and stress on these stitches. prepare the 2 tabs. So get your 2.5 by 6 inch piece of lining fabric and fold it in half. So if you're doing this with a fabric that has a right side and a wrong side, you want to fold it so that the right sides are showing. Okay, so fold it in half and press. Then unfold it and you'll see a nice crisp line. Then we're going to fold each side to meet that crease that you've just made. And then we're going to fold it in half so this edge meets this edge. I'm going to take it to the sewing machine. So now we want to top stitch down the sides, both sides of our tabs. So once again, I'm going to move my needle as far as I can get it to the right and line it up as best I can so it's as close to the edge. I'm going to line it up on my 1/4 inch mark again. Now, and when I do this, I stitch the open side first. Okay. So I'm going to back stitch again. Keep going. Now what I'm going to do with my tab and fold it in half again. Get my fabric scissors and chop it in half. So now you've got 2 tabs. So next what we want to do is we want to press our seams that we sewed previously flat. And so to do this we want to line up our seam with the center of our zipper tape, so we end up with a rectangle. Now you've got one side of the zipper is going to be open and we need to make sure that this zip stays open because we're going to need it later. Now it can be a bit fiddly with the zip open trying to get this all lined up. So what you can do is just take it quickly to your sewing machine and holding them together, just do a couple of stitches across the zip teeth on the outside here just to keep it together. So I'm just going to go quickly do that. Right, so my zip is now stitched together at the end. I'm going to open my zip back out. And I'm going to press out my seam. Now we want to do the same on our lining. Now our lining has that gap where we left that space to fold the bag through when we're nearly finished. So can get a little bit more tricky. So I'm going to start off with one of the sides with my fingers again, go to the other side and kind of pull it out, and that kind of forces that gap to fold out as well. And we want that fold because when we come to stitch it up, stitch the gap up, we can ensure that the seam is the same. I'm just going to put a couple of clips in because this is a good time to check that everything is looking square or rectangular. Okay, next bit is we are attaching the tabs. Okay, so the tabs are going to lie so that they meet in the middle. So you need to fold your tab in half again. We're going to line up the raw edges of our tab with the raw edges of our outer fabric. So you want the middle of your tab roughly in the middle of your seam line here. Now, I have found doing this, sometimes this tab moves about. You can put a pin in, try and keep it in place, but because it's quite thick here, your sewing machine is going to start moving things about. So what I'm going to do before I sew all the layers together, I'm going to go to my machine and just sew this tab in place. Right, so let's sew these tabs. Now when we come to sew all the layers together, we're going to sew it with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So when I sew my tab, I don't want it to be 3/8 of an inch, I want it to be slightly narrower. So 3/8 is approximately a centimetre, so I know that's here. So I'm going to sew it 1/4 of an inch, so I got a bit of wiggle room. So that's all stitched in place and that's not going to move anywhere now. What I'm going to do now, we take that clip out. I'm just going to cut off the excess zip, and I'm just using some everyday scissors, not my fabric scissors, to do this. Right, so now I'm going to stitch 3/8 of an inch through all the layers, beginning at the end of this seam here. So starting here and ending at the end of the press seam here. Just those two places, and I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and end. Remember, 3/8 of an inch, so about a centimetre. So now we want to do is we want to sew up these side seams, but we want to keep the main fabric and the lining fabric separate. Fold the lining, the outer fabric out of the way, and I'm going to sew along this edge and get it as close to my seam I've just sewn, get it as close to here as I can. And once again, I'm doing 3/8 of an inch. Make sure you don't sew any of your main fabric. So now I'm going to fold my lining fabric back and do the exact same on my main piece of fabric. It'll be easier for you to see. So you'll see that we are now getting a near enough continuous seam line between the seam we sewed over the zip and the seam we've just sewed on our main fabric and on our lining fabric. So now what we want to do is we want to do that for the 3 other sides on each, the main fabric and the lining fabric, so it will be 6 more seams in total. Okay, get on with that. So now that we've got all our seams sewn, I'm just going to put in a couple of clips. And I'm doing this from the lining side just because it's the lining that tends to move. And now we need to box out this bag. So from the seam and from the fold, we're going to measure 1 3/4 inches. Okay, so I'll do this one again. So with my ruler, I'm measuring from this fold 1 3/4, and this is where I'm using my Sharpie, because the fusible fleece just is quite tricky to mark with. 1 3/4 inches from the seam. And 1 3/4 to the fold. What I've done is actually cut a 1 3/4 square out already, so I'm going to go around and mark. So all my corners are now marked from the seam to the fold with a 1 3/4 inch. I've only done it on the lining, on the outer fabric, and as the clips are holding the lining fabric in place, all I'm going to do is cut through all the layers. Right, so all our corners have been boxed and cut out. Now we need to attach them. So you line up this corner to this seam here. So we're going to unfold it. And line it up. I'm going to pull out the sides and line up the raw edges. Then what we're going to do is we're going to sew a straight line across here with 3/8 of an inch. So let's get it lined up. So we're 3/8 of an inch. And there we have our first corner. So what we need to do now is do it to the other 7. So all my box corners are now sewn on my outer fabric and my lining. Looking a bit of a mess. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to trim these seams because I want a nice sharp corner on the outside of the bag. So I'm going to just perhaps just half off. So I'm going to do that to all the outside, the main fabric. Now it's time to turn it inside out, so or right side out. So we have our gap that we left in our lining. Now our zip should be open. Just going to push everything through. Zip is open. Open it. And just keep folding out. Right, so now that I'm happy with that, what we need to do is close up our gap in our lining that we left earlier. Now you can hand stitch this machine and just bag out the way. Just gonna start just after that pin. And remember to do your back stitching and get as close as you can to that edge. Our gap is all sewn together, so our bag is very nearly done. What I'm going to do is just, I have a point turner here. You could use anything, maybe end of a pencil, knitting needle, something like that. And I'm just going to go in and just press out, well, stick out my corners. Great. Fluff, but that is it. Your medium box bag. Thank you for watching, and if you like this video, please subscribe and take a look at my Etsy channel for any other kits that you might like to try.